wrap up our brief foray into the world of language by considering language from a very different point of view. And in this instance, we're talking about work that I actually do. This is the field that I actually work in. I mentioned I was a phonetician, but of late, in the last 15 years or so, I've been studying a peculiar form of language, which we'll discuss here. It's chant. Now, we've seen that there are very many aspects to language, and we've seen the predominant approach taken since the Second World War, casting language as an abstract system full of rules and so on, with names like French and German. And that way of thinking about language, while it's very conventional and often very useful, shouldn't distract us from the fact that there are many other aspects to language that are not captured there. Underlying that view of language is the computational theory of mind. And this computational theory of mind, again, something that has only developed since the Second World War, uses a particular way of talking about minds and people, which is so common that we tend to forget that it's just a way of talking. It's one way of coming at things. In particular, it treats conversation as if that were the main place where language happens, and as if in a conversation I was formulating meanings in my secret little mind and then turning them into sounds, which I pass, or writing, which I pass to you, and then you were decoding it in your secret little minds. Now, we don't have secret little minds. You can see that it's a bit of a metaphor. It's a way of thinking. But underlying that is this view of message passing, that communication, or whatever it is we're doing in language, is all about passing messages from speakers to listeners, from writers to readers. While that's very useful, it does leave out a lot. And it's to the lot that it leaves out that we're now turning. We're going to get away now from the idea that when we speak about language, we're speaking about something called French or English, and we're speaking about an abstract system with formal machinery like syntax. Very many of us linguists in the last sort of 20 years have moved beyond that to look at language in a more richly empirical way, taking account of the role of, for example, gestures. You'll notice when I'm talking here, my hands are always flapping about the place. And we do this in conversation too. We gesture all the time. We gesture even when we're talking on the phone and the other person can't hear us. Blind people gesture when they talk. And it's been found that if you make people sit on their hands so that they can't gesture, they have greater difficulty finding words. So gesture seems to be really important in this. I'm only talking about hand gesture here. Another thing that's left out of that abstract treatment of language is the role of the eyes. The eyes are fully engaged when we're talking. Now, we can talk without using our eyes. We can talk over the phone, for example. But when we're in a conversation face to face, it's worth looking at who looks at whom when. There's lots to be discovered there. We've mentioned the role of joint attention, paying attention to something jointly. Now, the formal generative approach to language doesn't concern itself with such matters at all, and yet we've seen they might be very, very important. We've also seen that in the generative approach, this system called language is extracted from any context in which it happens. So as we turn to other ways of thinking about language, we'll be paying a lot of attention to context. If you remember, the difference between pragmatics and semantics was that pragmatics studies meaning that arises when words are used in a particular context for particular purposes. Quite different from semantics, which is often abstract land. So there's lots of other sides to language. Maybe we need a different word. Some of us have felt that. It's not catching on. But those of us who like to draw this distinction sometimes use the word languaging to emphasize that we're talking about a lot of different things that don't all add up and resolve into one system with a name like French or German. So that's of some use. So as we leave behind this idea that language is concerned with English, French, Thai, we're still interested in, we share a lot of concerns with people who study language in that way. One thing that we're particularly interested in is, where did language come from? A question we visited here before. Now, if we start to think about languaging rather than syntax and so on, it becomes immediately clear that we're talking about something which is vastly older than writing, many, many, many thousands of years older than writing, something that happened to one species rather than another, and we've seen that human language has hugely affected us and is radically different in some respects from other forms of animal communication, but we have to understand it in an evolutionary or in a biological or in a deep time framework as well. Notice that when we were treating language abstractly with syntax and morphology and so on, we were concerned with the questions people were asking were, is this grammatical, is this not grammatical? Are these permissible sequences of sounds, are these not permissible sequences of sounds? Now you can play that game, and it's a very useful game to play, but when we consider the long history in which language arose as a form of biological communication, that kind of thinking makes no sense, because there's no obvious system, like English or French, most of the time in which people have been chattering to each other. So when we try to understand what happened to us rather than the chimpanzees, it's languaging that we need to turn to rather than generative linguistics. So in languaging, we'd be looking at situated, context-bound, vocally mediated, communicative behaviors, lots of different kinds, behaviors that allow people to collaborate and cooperate, so we'll call them affiliative behaviors. And these somehow gave rise to the human social world, with all its attendant problems. Let's have a look at a time scale here. What I've shown there, the green line, is approximately, I've indicated 50,000 years, which is a low, very conservative estimate for the time span in which humans have been using what we clearly recognize as language that comes together with culture and human ways of life. Now, language, of course, doesn't leave any fossils, as we've noted, but our evidence here comes from recognizing, for example, the formation of settlements, towns, villages, cities, the use of various forms of technology, all the way from fire through to decorative arts, the use of beads, the presence of music. Although music also doesn't leave fossils, we have found very, very, very old bone flutes, for example. So we can look back at least 50,000 years, and others would push that much further out. At least 50,000 years in which it looks like people have been languaging in a very, very human way. Now, the red line there shows the amount of time in which writing has been in the world. That's the documenting the emergence of writing in Mesopotamia some 5,500 years ago. But writing itself developed slowly and was only done by a few people. It was always a very elite profession. In ancient Egypt, the scribes were very important people, but certainly reading and writing wasn't something the general population did. And it wasn't until the inventing of the printing press in the 1400s that widespread literacy even became a possible thing. That's the little blue line there. Once you have widespread literacy, you can get people to obey rules, and you can set up institutions that say that's right and that's wrong. And you can develop this idea that there are well-defined systems like English and French. But for nearly all of this time, all of languaging has been done face to face using the voice only. So we're here dealing with spoken communication, not something that can be treated in the same way as writing. So I hope you can see that considering the timescales involved, generative linguistics is going to be of absolutely no use in understanding what happened to our species. Now, the generative linguists would disagree with this very clearly, but I'm going to make that claim. My own work is concerned with languaging which is older than writing. We don't know how old it is. You can call it chanting. You know what chanting is, but I'm going to call it joint speech. And joint speech has a great advantage to it. Unlike many of the topics we'll be talking about in this module, you actually know when you've got an example of it. Nobody's ever found a mind, but finding joint speech is easy. You're in the presence of joint speech if there are multiple people making the same sounds at the same time. Okay, so we can just take that little definition, go out and have a look. Where do people make the same sounds at the same time? And it turns out they engage in this behavior in really interesting and very important situations. That's the context, you see. The making sounds bit is the reason that we're looking at specific contexts, but those contexts are what we're asking about now. What we find is, oh, look at all that joint speech going on in the temples and churches. Prayer and ritual always feature joint speech. Oh, there's a bunch of joint speech that's not in the temple. Look, it's in protest. Wherever people protest, they chant. Oh, there's a load more joint speech over there in the football stadia. In some sports, not all sports, chanting is a absolutely crucial, very, very old part of how you engage in that sport. Now, if you think that language is only about message passing, then nothing here makes any sense whatsoever. But clearly, we're using our voice as a spoken behavior. As I said, it's older than writing, for reasons I'm not going to go into here. And these situations that we met here are quite charged. There's a lot we'd like to understand about human social development, human social formation, the grounding of human societies, the grounding of human identities. That seems to be particularly present when people are doing this chanting business, this joint speech business. So we find it in ritual and prayer. We find it in law courts. People swear oaths publicly. When you become a naturalized citizen of Ireland or many countries, you stand up in public, raise your hand, and swear an oath publicly. It has to be done in public. We mentioned protest and sports. We do this spontaneously. If you go to a school playground, you may find a child being bullied, and there's a ring around that child, and the bullies are chanting at the child, nye, 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 or similar. So these activities, they're not all institutionally organized, like bullying is not institutionally organized, but they are found in pretty much every human society. Another one that I've actually left off here is primary school education. In primary schools across the world, regardless of whether you're being schooled in a Western European mode or you're in a Islamic madrasa in Pakistan, your primary school will involve chanting. And there's a very interesting use of chant, by my definition of joint speech, which we're all familiar with and we don't even think about, but it's a little ritual that we all take part in, and that's singing happy birthday to someone. You're familiar with the situation. Someone's got their birthday and we all bring out the cake and we sing happy birthday. Everyone joins in. It would be kind of rude not to join in. It's really important that this be done. It's a ritual celebrating the birthday of an individual, and it's very, very widespread behavior. So there's lots here to understand. The funny thing about this is that it makes you look at things that originally seem completely distinct and makes you look at them together and say, oh, I wonder what they have in common. So take this, for example. We're going to, first of all, I'm going to play you a prayer from
Hail Mary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
You may have seen people saying the rosary before. Some of it was joint speech, some isn't. We're not worried about that. What we're asking here, we know the sounds aren't magic, but what people are doing is somehow very important. And if you're saying the rosary, that's very important for the nun's life. But usually we think that belongs in the domain of religion and something the nuns do, so most of us aren't interested. But what we're asking here is... That's an impassioned protest from the 2011 so-called Arab Spring uprisings, this time from Cairo. And look, there was call and response. There's one person says something and then everyone else joins in. There's lots and lots of similarities. So it's the similarities we're interested in here. And clearly we're not talking about religion anymore, but we're talking about some very widespread and fundamental human behavior. So here's some things that pop out at you and that give me at least much pause to think. First of all, we're using the voice. It's oral behavior, extremely important to humans, used in important situations, so it definitely belongs in languaging. But speakers and listeners are no longer separate, so it's not about message passing. Everyone knows the texts that are being spoken. Frequently, not always, but frequently, the texts are repeated again and again and again. I'm using text just to illustrate the words. I don't mean written text. Okay. These words are repeated again and again and again and again. Now, if you were trying to communicate something, that would make no sense. Once your message has got through, you're done. But here there's something important about the actual act of speaking. So it's, in a sense, performative. It has to be done. Remember, you have to swear the oath. In all cases, there's something like identity being generated. It's intrinsic to the nuns' ways of life that they recite the rosary. The protesters are insisting that they have an identity which is not being acknowledged. Football supporters are generating their identity as supporters of this team or that team, and they're doing it week in, week out, again with a lot of repetition. The words that they're speaking are not authored on the spot. They're not made up on the fly. So this has nothing to do with Chomsky's concerns about creativity. In both those examples, we saw something that's very common, which is call and response. One person says something and a bunch of people say something else. This allows for joint speech to carry very complex meanings. For example, in a religious ritual like the Mass, there may be a complicated bit of the text, of the liturgical text, which the priest says solo, but then everyone joins in, Amen. And that little bit of joint speech in there allows everyone to partake in this performative uttering of the words. Amen is an example of a generalized assent, and you can get the same thing in a protest march when someone makes a political speech on stage and everyone else goes, hell yeah! So again, we're not talking about religion, we're talking about something that shapes the form of religion and protest and sports and lots of other things. And another funny thing when you look at a lot of this is that we find examples which are quite musical, we find examples which are definitely not musical, and we find everything in between. Now I leave it up to you to decide whether Happy Birthday is musical or not. It's usually sung in 47 keys all at once, out of time. Nobody goes home and listens to their recordings of their favorite renditions of Happy Birthday, and yet we call it a song. So while a generative linguist would see language here, music there, nothing in common, here they're completely mixed up. And there's all kinds of things to be found once you go looking. Here's a nice example of a recurring pattern that proves very, very stable. As far as I know, this pattern first emerged in 1973 in Chile in protests after the coup, which deposed a guy called Salvador Allende and installed a dictator called Pinochet. And so the first version of this we're going to hear is the words used in Chile, so it's in Spanish, but this example is from many years later. That protest chant is in Spanish. It's El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido. Excuse my poor Spanish pronunciation, but it means the people united will never be defeated. But that was a rousing chant that was found widespread use. And we see it cropping up again. We see that pattern, that chant pattern, that is the boom, 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 boom. Here's a bunch of students in Dublin protesting about their education. No rights, no books, no education cuts. No rights, no books, no education cuts. No ifs, no buts, no education cuts. The people united will never be defeated. I mentioned the tragically misnamed Arab Spring uprisings of 2011. Here's another example of that from Cairo with the chant that became the central chant of that. Look at the size of that crowd. It's a huge, very effective chant. It's in Arabic this time, Ashab Yurid Isqat al-Nizam, which means the people demand the fall of the regime. And that became very, very widespread, and most people didn't notice that it's using this pattern that we know at least from 1970s Chile. You find it in Cairo. Here it is once more, the same Arabic chant. Now, one thing you'll have noticed is it's kind of hard to make out the words. Well, of course, I'm playing Arabic and Spanish at you, so it's going to be hard unless you're a speaker of those languages. But joint speech is not about producing intelligible words that have to be decoded by somebody else. Now, there's lots more to say here. As I said, this is my playground. There's a website with lots more information on it, and there's a website of a whole book I wrote on the subject. But I am going to ask you to watch a video on the topic. It's about a 40-minute talk, which I gave in China. You don't have to follow that URL there. This is for people who might be watching this on YouTube. You'll find it in Brightspace under the required viewing for this talk, for this unit. And it goes in much more detail into some of these peculiar aspects of chanting. So, simply defining what we were studying, multiple people saying the same thing at the same time, opened up a whole world of phenomena, which if we hadn't done that, we might have been oblivious to, might never have noticed. And you might ask, how would we integrate this kind of study into standard ways of viewing the person? And it's not easy. We're kind of limited in the stories we tell about ourselves, but cognitive science has many explanatory frameworks available to us. And in my case, I've found a kind of approach which we're developing in embodied cognitive science called Enaction. I have found it to be useful. It gives us a kind of a vocabulary which allows us to speak of collective subjects rather than always talking about individual persons. So if we take the approach of psychology that psychology usually takes, which is that one person has one mind and everything we're going to talk about that person goes on in that secret little mind, that's not the way we approach it in embodied cognitive science and specifically in action, but we recognize different kinds of subjects that come into being. Enaction means to come into being by doing in different contexts. So in this way, what we are doing when we are chanting is enacting our identity as nuns, as Man United supporters, as protesters, and all kinds of everything in between. So that wraps up our little foray into language. As you can see, it's a topic that opens up in many ways. It's been hugely important in the computational theory of mind, and specifically generative linguistics has been the field that has got entangled with philosophy of mind there. But I hope you see that there's very many other things to say, and we don't have any single clean definition of language. We shouldn't have, really. There's too much going on. There's lots of things going on. Look at my hands. Lots of things going on here. Lots of things to study. Right.